Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibis? Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Good to have you here on this Monday. Hope you had a great weekend. Mine was busy, going full force on that deck being rebuilt. And then my dog, of course, you know, animals never get sick under normal business hours. So I did take my big dog River to the vet. He had an allergic reaction to something. It was so expensive. Oh my gosh. But he's better. He's good. So that's all that matters. My dogs are my family. I've had a lot of inboxes of people thanking me for doing these summaries of these episodes. Some people can't bring themselves to watch because it hits too close to home, but they were curious as to what the content of it was. Now, this weekend, I did watch the Warren Jeffs 4-part special on Netflix. If you're able and you haven't seen it, it is very eye-opening. In a lot of ways, it's similar to the IBLS, different in that they're marrying off young teenagers, kids who are having babies by the time they're 15 with these old men. It's gross. And lots of physical abuse. But at the same time, it's sort of the same concept of the authority rule. Women and children they're inferior, and they're essentially there to be at the beck and call of men. So many crimes happen within both of these organizations. And I think it's an important narrative to talk about, because the problem is I've had a lot of people inbox me, why don't more come out and say, I've been a victim? And the thing is, these families a lot of times are having 20 kids. They're having tons of kids. And these infants are raised from the time they're out of the womb in this belief system. They're uneducated, so they have nowhere to go. If they get to be an adult and say, you know, I really want to get out of this. A lot of times these women have multiple kids. They have a dozen or more kids and no education. They have nowhere to go. I would love to see resources where these things are busted wide open and infiltrated and people are arrested for crimes, but I don't think it's going to be on any large scale anytime soon. They're very protective of their beliefs and insular, so people just don't report. A lot of times, unfortunately, these victims don't even know they're victims. They don't understand what was done to them was wrong, and it's very heartbreaking. Music fact of the day, Billy Idol was cast as the T-1000 robot in Terminator 2 Judgment Day. He was in a motorcycle accident shortly before filming began and was replaced by Robert Patrick, who totally owned that role. You know, there's just certain roles you can't imagine anybody else playing, and this is one for me. I remember when it was released, it was visually just insane for the time it was released. It's my favorite of the two, but I was listening to Rebel yell this morning as I'm doing some housework, and I thought, you know, I need to do a Billy Idol music fact. Not really a music fact, but I love his music. All right, so we're going to jump into episode 3. I was a little ambitious when I thought I could sum this up in 2 episodes, but the more I watched, there are things to pick out without even going into the worst parts of the graphic things. Episode 3 starts out with Jill talking about that Megyn Kelly interview that her and her sister Jessa did shortly after the scandal became public about the molestation. She says she doesn't like talking about it because she's not proud of it. She felt she had to do it to save the show and also for the sake of her parents. Otherwise, she had no interest in doing it. And I think that it's really important to note here that even though Jill is very far removed from the family and the IBLS teachings as a whole at this point, it seems that what was ingrained in her from such a young age is still very much a worry in her mind about being disobedient. And it's sad to see her talk about how she sort of blames herself for it not working to get the show back on the air. Just still has a strong hold in some ways on some of these beliefs about disobeying her parents and things like that. On having a film crew in the house, Jim Bob was speaking at a conference and said it's not invasive, and the kids had gotten used to the cameras in their face. Of course, a lot of these kids were really small when this started. They probably don't remember much life without a camera in their face. They showed Bill Gothard saying whatever they do for work should be full-time Christian work. And Jim Bob said that this show was a ministry that God opened up through the show being aired on TLC. Floyd is back on, and he said it's common for people in IBLS to sign a contract agreeing to certain rules and behaviors. Cousin Amy says she wonders if more secrets will come out, and talks about how many families are suffering without anybody knowing. probably way more than we even want to imagine. I would venture a guess to say that abuse is more prevalent than not in these households, just from what we've seen. The problem is a lot of times victims don't realize they're victims. And so they just think this is how it's supposed to be. Just a cycle. You have kids being born into these, they're raised in this, they know nothing different. And so our beliefs in the real world are very foreign and abrasive and ungodlike. So you see how these cycles just keep going. We've heard they were building an army for God. The reach that Bill Gothard himself had, even before the TLC show came on the air, it was huge. They show a clip of Jill and Derek from the first episode of that spinoff after TLC canceled the Duggars, Jill and Jessa counting on. It shows Anna, Jill, and Jessa at separate points doing their little sit-down interviews for the camera crying. Jill says they will come out of this stronger as a family unit. Tia makes a good point saying that this was exploiting the girls and they did this spinoff on the back of their abuse stories. It seemed like Jim Bob just didn't want the cash cow to stop. He wanted to have this money coming in and just totally took advantage of his own daughters to get the spinoff on the air. And we're going to go into that here soon. Jill is crying on the screen saying you've worked through it, you've dealt with it, you've moved on. She didn't want it rubbed in her face all the time. This interview was on, I believe, maybe that first episode of the spinoff series. But her tears and her body language was heartbreaking. You can see that she's still struggling internally with these beliefs and shaming her parents or disobeying her parents, even though she, from what I understand, may not have much of a relationship at all with her parents and IBLS material at this point. But it's still that deep-seated pounding in their heads and their hearts that here's your position in this family, and you're a woman, and your job is to serve and to be under the authority of everybody but your own self. It just makes me so sad to think that it was her responsibility to clean up the mess that Josh made and that her parents allowed to happen and swept under the rug. And not only that, but forced her and the other victims in that house to stay in that house with their abuser and smile on camera. It makes me so mad. They show interviews with the other Duggar kids, and John David, speaking of his brother Josh, said there was no way any of them could have known that he was leading such a secret life. Danielle Linderman is introduced and said the show tried to portray Jim Bob as kind of a lovable lug. He always seemed calm, never saw him raise his voice, and she said she thinks this is a ruse to hide the power that he held over his family. She points out also that you see Jim Bob handpicking his daughter's husbands. They cut to a clip of one of the girls' husbands asking the other husbands if Jim Bob grilled them about their finances. And Derek said it was on page 45 of the questionnaire. And so I kind of paused right here and I'm making my notes and I thought, he's joking. He's just making a funny. And no. He wasn't. They had to fill out questionnaires before they could court or marry these girls. Derek was from the same area as Jill, but their paths never crossed. Derek was going to Nepal on a mission and asked Jim Bob to be a prayer partner of his. They got close over time, and Jim Bob gave Derek Jill's number. Jill said Jim Bob also knew that Jill had friends who were trying to set her up with two different guys. And Jill said that Jim Bob was trying to get his man in there first, and he won. She looks at Derek and they kind of both laugh. They show a clip from where Derek said he's itching to start an official courtship, and she agrees. This is back when he was out of the country, maybe Nepal, and Jim Bob and Jill visited him. Courtship has to be understood in terms of a patriarchal authority. It's about purity, but more about control. They show a clip of Bill Gothard saying that the father is responsible for his daughter's purity until marriage. They show a clip of the kiss at the end of Jill and Derek's wedding, and Derek says you have no choice that 4.4 million people are watching your wedding, which, by the way, was the highest rated show TLC had at that point. The day before her marriage, Jill signed this contract. She said her dad just kind of had it on the end of the table and said, hey, look, I need you to sign something real quick. He didn't tell her what it was, and it ended up being a contract to bind all the kids to TLC for 5 years. The kids were never a part of the negotiations on that. They showed Derek announced to the family that they're pregnant with their first child. And Jim Bob says, so 30 days into the marriage, you find out you're expecting. Derek says, tomorrow's our 1 month anniversary. And like the body language on everybody was so awkward. But here's the thing. This goes to show how Jim Bob has no clue about a woman's body, even though he's had, 19, 20 kids. They count pregnancy from the first date of your last menstrual cycle. So it's totally possible that within a month she got pregnant and found out. I always found out I was pregnant. I always tested positive like 2 weeks after I got pregnant. So you can test early. These tests today are designed to detect it super, super early, way before our moms found out. It's just that's how science has progressed. Jill said that TLC told her they were thinking about the birth of their child and filming the labor and the delivery. And Jill and Derek said they didn't want them there at all. And TLC was like, at all? And she said TLC was just blown away that they were not welcome in the delivery room. And Derek says, you don't want to go through what Anna Duggar went through, which is Josh Duggar's wife. They show a clip of Anna sitting on the toilet in labor giving birth. And Josh kind of looks at the camera and snickers and says, we're going to have a baby right here in the bathroom. And actually, you see Jill deliver that baby. Jill was a certified midwife. I believe at this point, she's not doing that anymore. Jill had made up her mind that nobody was going to sit there and watch her while she was in labor. They show a clip of Jill, and it's a home movie of her saying it's 3:43 a.m. and my water just broke. Derek says they lost, and TLC is going to get what they want. Jill said TLC gave them a camera for them to shoot their own footage of the labor and delivery. I mean, that's just so far beyond crossing boundaries to force people to have cameras at a very private and exciting moment in their lives. Derek's on camera saying that Jill had been laboring a couple of days at that point, and Jill said they did a lot of work so TLC could have their footage. They had to do these diaries where they set it up on a tripod, and just I would have thrown that camera down the hallway if I were them, but they had a contract. Danielle says the women in the show are a draw for the audience, and they show clips of all the women having babies. She said the girl were doing things just like the Kardashians were, but the Kardashians were financially compensated for their private stuff being aired all over network TV. Jill said after the birth of their first child, they asked TLC for compensation, just enough to cover her out-of-pocket medical expenses. Derek said TLC told them they already had paid the family and they would need to talk to Jim Bob about that. Heather Heath said it's very normal for the father to take all the money brought into the house. Jill said the whole time doing these shows over the years, she was never paid. And that included into 7.5 years of her being an adult. They flash back to 2009 and we see these kids doing construction work in an episode called Do It Yourself Duggars. Michelle said she's amazed at what can get done with a group of children who are willing to work. And every one of the kids are out there sweating and working. And she said they're some of the hardest working people you'll ever meet. Floyd says you were expected to serve solely for the benefit of serving. They flash to an IBLP promo showing kids building things, and it says there are many ministry opportunities for your sons and daughters. They showed this long list of programs that you could participate in, and was being a midwife, log cabin program, cosmetology, the financial freedom seminar, which I know Jim Bob said was how he became independently wealthy or out of debt. Some of these are months long, and they can go up to several years if you worked inside those training centers. These training centers were popping up all over the place. They would host older teens into the young adults, early 20s age. Heather says you're told college is useless and you're going to be brainwashed if you go. Josh P. said that parents were essentially signing their kids up for long hours, sometimes 16 hours a day of just child labor. Jim Holt says that when Josh was sent away after the molestation became known, that the IBLP facility they were doing construction work at was punishment. That was his punishment, was to build these structures and to do masonry work. IBLP grew to have headquarters, and there were training centers they were sprouting up all the time. They added training centers for things such as character. Alert was a training center where Brooke Arnold said the acronym sounds better than Militia of Homeschool Boys, which sounded scarier. They show footage of young man at essentially what looks like a boot camp. And Floyd explains that the alert group was deeply rooted in the IBLP's position on authority. A recording promoting the alert program says, "Our God is a God of authority. He will continue to guide and control all that he has planned for our future." And in the video, they show you can see pain and sadness on these young men's faces. And Brooke said she didn't think their parents realized how hard this was or that anything terrible was going to happen to their children at these training institutes. Laura Smith is introduced and says, if you got in trouble while at one of these training institutes, they might lock you up in a prayer room for days or even weeks. The prayer room was an empty hotel room with no furniture. You were given a Bible until they determined you had repented. That decision a lot of times was actually left up to your peers, other young people who were deemed as team leaders. In an IBLP promotional video, it says, when the team leader holds up 3 fingers, young children know it's time to smile. Laura said her worst time there was when her team leader didn't like the shoes she had on because they had a tiny little heel on them. And it wasn't against the rules. It was a personal thing with her team leader. The team leader thought it was distracting to men. So what do? They send Laura to the prayer room for 4 days. She was 16 years old at the time, by the way. Heather Heath talks about going to Walmart to get feminine hygiene products such as tampons. She said when she got back, they went through her stuff and took it because it took her purity. Floyd said shame was how they kept them all in line. And also, just the constant fear of making the slightest slip up to send you to a place of eternal torture. In the Oklahoma City Training Center, they sealed the windows shut so that young people would not be tempted to literally throw themselves out the window. Lindsay Williams recalls seeing a housemate with a big knife to her throat. She said the Bible says it's better to put a knife to your throat than to be a glutton. Laura said that Bill Gothard was everywhere and he would visit these training centers all the time. Floyd said Gothard was like a celebrity. Brooke Arnold said that Gothard said he only took a small portion of the money and he drove an old car, but she found out the entire Gothard family was living an extravagant life. She said her family struggled to pay for the seminars that he put on because they were really expensive. The ATI homeschooling program, apparently very expensive as well. It's interesting because after watching the Warren Jeffs documentary this weekend, right before the walls closed in and he was apprehended, he went out and dressed in civilian clothes and was going to football games and Disney World and all the things that he preached were worldly. He was out there living it up. You see planes, you see these gold-plated hallways. Brooke said IBLP grew into a huge organization that had very real political power and connections. At the training centers, they would campaign for candidates that Bill Gothard had an interest in them being elected. So they were essentially told who to vote for in elections. He was connecting with politicians like Mike Huckabee, Sarah Palin, and IBLP's biggest donor, David Green, who is the CEO of Hobby Lobby. They show an interview with David Green, and he says, in our culture, you have seen a deterioration of character. He said it should be obvious to any businessman that this is a great need. A lot of the training centers they had were gifts actually from local governments. These city governments would give them these buildings to make training centers out of. Gothard wanted the 10 Commandments back in schools and says that the character first teachings have no overt reference to God or the Bible, and they said it was not a backdoor way of introducing these beliefs into public school. In the Oklahoma City location, they taught them how to essentially gaslight children into Bible studies. They called them character coaches, and Laura said no parental permission was needed for these kids to attend this, and they were totally indoctrinating kids. A news voiceover is played where the program was accused of teaching blind obedience to authority. And it's scary how far and wide these principles and these teachings have spread. It made it into private prisons with Correction Corporation America, one private prison company, had the teachings in 28 of their prisons, with 12 more expected to start doing it at the time that promo was recorded. They show a prisoner who said this is why he came to prison, was specifically for these teachings. The teachings spread into the military and even the police. They show Ray Nash, who is the founder of something called the Police Dynamics Institute, speaking. He said if all the layers of authority are lined up correctly, the one in authority should simply have to speak and it should get done. There were training centers all over the world. This is kind of what shocked me. They were in Russia, New Zealand, Australia, Mexico, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore. Derek talks about this big international trip the entire family took. Josh Pease said the 19 kids and counting became a huge recruiting tool for the group. The Discovery Network had 1.5 billion global subscribers at the time the show was at the peak of its fame. Jim Bob is seen given an interview, and he says Discovery gave them the ability to use that show to include a lot of Bible principles they live by. And through TLC, they've enabled it to go around the world. It shows the Duggars on a trip to El Salvador. And Brooke said the final season where the Duggars essentially were kind of being seen as fish out of water. And it shows the Duggars on a Japanese TV show, and the girls were being dressed as geishas. Michelle said this was different from what they were accustomed to. They showed Jim Bob on the street asking a random man what his faith background was. And the man said he really didn't believe in God. And it was crazy because even these little kids were looking at this man like, what? Really? And Jim Bob tells the man that God had a plan for his life and loves him. Then he goes on to say, we just have to repent from sin, turn to him, and give him control of our life. Jill said in 2016, her and Derek were living in El Salvador doing mission work, had just gotten this Counting On series with Jill and Jessa up and running. So TLC was pressing Jill and Derek and their child to come back to the States for a shoot. They didn't want to leave, and they told them they can't not come. Jill said that was news to them and asked, why are you surprised we can't come? Since they knew that Jill and Derek were planning on being in El Salvador for 10 months. And Jill said that TLC had been there filming them. And she said at this point, it was a matter of principle that her and Derek were going to be in El Salvador. And if they wanted to film them, they could come to El Salvador. She said that was the first time that her and Derek told her family, no, just got firm. She said this was an aha moment for her and Derek. TLC said, you have to. Jim Bob proceeds to send Jill and Derek the signature page and the obligation section of the contract. If you remember the last episode, Jill talked about it was close to her wedding. It was chaos. And Jim Bob said, hey, I need you to sign that paper on the table. And she said they were just kind of grabbing people as they ran past getting ready for this wedding. Jill thought maybe her signature had been forged. And then she saw it and realized, whoa, that is my signature. But she didn't know what she was signing. Derek said they had never given their word to be committed to anything. And he said this was fraud. Jill said they were freaking out, not knowing if the contract held any water. And she was actually worried if they came back to the States, they could be arrested for not holding up the contract. I've been on the road covering trials for 12 weeks so far this year, and Base has made my travel so much easier. It's an overpacker's dream. It can be hard to fit everything in, especially when it comes to luggage, but with Base, there's room for everything. Base was created by actress Shay Mitchell to make sleek and affordable bags, luggage, and accessories designed to help you travel effortlessly while still looking fashionable. Base has thought of everything you could ever want in a piece of luggage. 360-degree gliding wheels, a cushion handle, a built-in weight indicator that has saved me from last-minute overweight luggage fees and scrambling to balance weight between my bags. We've all been there. It also has washable bags for your dirty clothes and all the interior pockets you need to keep organized. Their luggage comes in multiple sizes and colors, and for shorter trips, the Weekender bag is super functional. It even has a place to store your shoes separately. I can see why Base has over 30,000 5-star reviews, one of those from me. Right now, Base is offering my listeners 15% off your first purchase by visiting basetravel.com/whattheworld. Go to basetravel.com/whattheworld for 15% off your first purchase. That's Base, BEIS travel.com/whattheworld. Derek said if they're giving something up, they should get something in return. And Jim Bob, get this, offered him $10 an hour. Derek said, I don't know what it's worth. And Jim Bob was like, what's your price? And they went back and forth with the same thing. They asked to talk to TLC, and they were told by Jim Bob's PR guy, Chad, that they couldn't talk to anyone on the phone without him because the contract was not with Jill and Derek. It was with Jim Bob. And Chad said, I have to be involved in these conversations. And as you can guess, Jill and Derek were never able to talk to TLC. Jill said maybe TLC thought they could speak up if they had a problem, but Jill said that was not the boat we were in. They show a news article where Derek said that at one point they were relying on food banks to feed their family due to being in a financial hardship. And that was stemming from Jim Bob just totally hoarding their money and not compensating these kids. Jim Bob told Jill around this time, thanks to Derek, I'm going to have to go ahead and pay some of the older kids a lump sum. He said some of the boys were wanting to start their own business, so he thought it was a good time. Nah, you ain't got forced there, Jim Bob. He paid the kids what would be the equivalent of them making minimum wage up to the age of 18. But get this, here's the kicker. In order to get your lump sum, he made the kids sign another contract with him and his production company, which was called Mad Family. And that was pretty much a lifetime contract. Jill said after that, they were done. They walked away. Derek said they found out on social media that TLC had ended their relationship with Jill and Derek. Derek says if we ever even had a relationship with them. They show a YouTube Q&A with fan questions asking if they regretted leaving the show, and they say no. Then they said they're not on the best of terms with some of her family, and she said they've had disagreements. Derek said they did not want to keep going on with no change. Get this, Derek starts getting these anonymous text messages that were threatening. And I'm going to read these because I paused and typed out the entire text because they kind of just scrolled through it really quickly. So let's read what one of these text messages says. In the true account of Noah and his sons, one of his sons, Ham, revealed his father's weaknesses to his brothers. But those wise brothers, Shem and Japheth, backed up with a blanket to cover their drunk father. When Noah awoke, he knew what Ham had done. Because of that wrong action, he was forever barred from the family blessing. It goes on to say, as a son-in-law, Jill's parents are also yours biblically. Whatever you do to them is the same as doing it to your own parents. The mistreatment of parents is forbidden in the testaments with death penalties ascribed to those violations and wrong actions, and the reverse promise that things will not go well for you. As his son, Scripture bars you from speaking against him publicly. Love covers all sin. Jim Bob or Michelle have never done you or Jill wrong. You are returning evil from the unbelievable privilege of marrying their most beautiful and intelligent daughter, who is the fruit of their lives. You are a trusted man to be given the high privilege of courting and marrying their treasured daughter. Godly, well-trained, talented, capable. Never was there a girl like Jill. I was there watching them grow up. The love and dedication they had for all their children. We watched closely in wonder and amazement and admiration for their great love and habit of letting other people support you. Then it goes on to accuse Derek of trying to let Jim Bob support them. Is it possible you are the one who is angry because he won't support you and hand out money to you? I know for a fact he does not give money to any young man because it's a known fact it will destroy their initiative. That is a wise choice to have young men learn to stand on their own 2 feet. He is doing you and the others a great favor, Derek. I watched he and Michelle as a young couple running a wrecker service day and night, an ice cream shop, a convenience store with maddening hours. By hurting Jim Bob, you're hurting yourself and your own family. Don't you realize you will sow what you reap? Whoever rewards evil for good, evil will not depart from his house. Is this what you want? Jim Bob has done you no evil, and you have done him great evil. God always sends a prophet before judgment comes. You could repent, Derek, before it's too late. I pray I'm not speaking in the ears of a fool, Derek. Sincerely, a true friend in Christ. Unbelievable. Derek asked if someone is claiming to be a true friend, then why are you using a burner phone to text me anonymously? When asked by the producer if he thought Jim Bob sent that, Derek said he couldn't speculate. Jill said she didn't think so. They show another text. It could be the same text, but I think I got that all in the first, saying they never mistreated you and you know it. He picked you to marry this beautiful, untouched virgin, Derek. He trusted you. I know he gave you that house and many other perks. Derek did report that text with the threats of death to the police and told them exactly what the threat was. Jill said it's the whole culture of fear and lack of trust. Jill said essentially her parents were saying, we don't bless what you're doing, so you have to do what we want you to do. With obeying authority, it wasn't necessarily your parents. It was whoever the oldest male present at that time would be your authority if you were a woman or a child. Lindsay said when she was at the training center, one of the males who was in charge of the maintenance came into her bed and she didn't know how to tell him to leave. Backtalk was not tolerated. Any resistance was beaten out of them at a young age, and she was assaulted and said it's rampant in those training centers. Bill Gothard was the subject of a sex scandal in 1980. His brother Steve Gothard was using his position within the IBLP to harass women and also have them perform acts on him. People came forward claiming Steve had abused and harassed multiple people at the office, which surprised me that anybody would speak up against a Gothard. Good for them. Bill sent his brother to a campus with less oversight. They show a promo for a training center in Michigan, and it looks like a summer camp. It shows kayaking, tubing, and hiking. And then we see Bill Gothard lecturing on a dock next to a sailboat. There was a landing strip for a Learjet that IBLP owned at this training center. Girls who disobeyed Bill got sent to Steve in the Northwoods. At one point, Bill Gothard was caught with a young woman in a cabin, and this comes to a boiling point. Bill and his brother Steve are confronted by everybody who worked for them. Bill was trying to find ways to keep his brother Steve in the organization, and his solution was just to have Steve marry one of the women. And what's kind of surprising to me was that even with how strict the rules of authority and obedience are in this cult, his own board of directors said, no, that is not a solution that we're going to go for. Bill decides to get rid of Steve, but came up with a new teaching, which is the Matthew 18 teaching, which made it forbidden to gossip. Isn't that convenient? That meant making allegations against leaders in particular. They show some of the Duggar girls, including Jill and Jessa, on stage saying, praise publicly. And if you have something negative to say, go to the person privately. A woman named Kristen is being interviewed, and she said the culture makes it hard for women to report abuse. Emily Anderson is ex-IBLP and attended some of those conferences that Jim Bob and Michelle did together. She said she always wished her own parents had the kind of marriage that she perceived Jim Bob and Michelle had. And when Emily was 10, her family just kind of fell apart. Her father had molested her. And she talks about people asking if her mom knew what was happening. She said her mom knew the family was in great danger, but her mom was in a cult too. Bill Gothard spotted her when she was 13. He was 71 at the time. He asked when she turned 14 to quit homeschooling and move to the Chicago headquarters indefinitely. Bill took a female assistant, looked the assistant straight in her eyes, and pointed to Emily and said, do not let this one go. Josh P. said as time went on, it was obvious that Bill kind of had a type. Jill said it was rumored that the blonde girls tended to be the ones to get picked. They show an IBLP promo video, and it says the Lord had entrusted to the Institute this year the Journey to the Heart, and it says students get trained and one-on-one counsel from Bill Gothard. Journey to the Heart was a 10-day camp, and Bill would be there teaching lessons throughout the day. Everybody who came had a personal meeting with him. Derek said the Journey to the Heart seemed to him more like a vetting process to see which types Bill would invite for long-term things. He thinks the interview were mainly to learn vulnerabilities of the young women. Lindsay was 18 when she met Bill, and she went into kind of a dark room with his assistant who was sitting over in the corner, and Bill was behind the desk, and she said it was very intimidating and ominous. He asked her to come to work at headquarters. She said, I don't know how to emphasize to the audience that headquarters apparently was the place to be in her mind. It was the highest you could go as a female in this cult. And she said, if it's what Gothard wants, then in return it's what God wants. Emily said meeting Gothard is the equivalent of meeting the Pope, the president, and Justin Bieber all rolled up into one. They cut to Gothard saying he must be the most blessed person he knows. Brooke talks about how Gothard's appearance was weird, saying that he had an odd look like a Lego-shaped head, and talked about his ill-fitting Men's Warehouse suits. Heather Heath said he could draw people in just like the snake in the Jungle Book, and they show a scene where the snake's singing a song about trust me, and you see Mowgli's eyes kind of start spinning like he's in a trance. Thought that was a good little visual there for comparison. Gothard's giving a speech, Keys to Fulfillment in the Marriage Relationship. And he says, husbands, treat her like a china teacup and not like a coffee mug. He goes on to say to repopulate the earth with godly sons and daughters. Now is the time. Then he says, I made up my mind I would never kiss a girl until my wedding night. Emily reminds the audience that Bill Gothard never married and never had children, but also that nobody ever questioned that because ultimately his revelations came directly from God. She said, you would be chosen to ride in Bill Gothard's van. And Laura said they were all under the age of 18 and he always had a girl next to him. And there would be some heavy petting and he would put his hands on their legs and things like that, even up their skirts. They never talked about it amongst themselves. And she said she knew it was weird, but she didn't know it was wrong. When Emily was 18, Bill called her father and said, your daughter explains to me she wants to learn how to respect her father. As Bill Gothard said this to her father over the phone, he looked at her and winked. She ended up at headquarters, of course. When Bill talked to her, he made her dad out to be the villain and said dad had lost all authority over her and now Bill Gothard was her authority. Laura said at headquarters they would have these therapy sessions where he would wait for his assistant to leave and he asked questions like, are you pure? And she said, of course. She had no clue what sex was or how babies were made. Now, I mean, these are older teenagers. And they have no clue. There are no words. She said there would be times where they would kneel to what she thought was pray, and he would rub her hand. And she would explain they have a 6-inch rule within the IBLP where men and women should have 6 inches between them. And she said this little prayer session would happen several times a week. Emily said Bill Gothard told her, you belong here. I love you. You know that, right? Your father doesn't love you, but I love you. He touched her and asked her to come to his office. And she said it was kind of a dark hallway. And when they opened the door, there was still a male assistant of Bill Gothard's there. And she said Bill Gothard looked totally startled to see that man in there. She said when she got home from headquarters, the abuse by her dad was worse because Bill had made promises to her dad. And her dad expected her to submit to more of his authority. Lindsay said she is one of many that Bill took advantage of, but none of them felt they could say anything about it to anybody. The girls would be blamed essentially for bringing it upon themselves. Wisdom Booklet 36 teaches the law of crying out. We covered this in that pre-episode I did before I started summarizing all these episodes. But essentially, if you don't cry out while it's happening, the assault, then you are equally to blame. Heather says in one of the wisdom circles, they had them go around and talk about if they had been a victim, and if so, what they did to deserve the attack. They cut to Michelle. She said that she was involved in cheerleading and gymnastics. And Jim Bob says she would kind of dance around out there in a short skirt, and she had no clue what guys thought. Then Michelle chimes in and says it was defrauding. She said, defrauding is stirring up desires you cannot righteously fulfill. Heather says you can't exist without being accused of tempting a man to attack you. They show a clip from a conference, Basic Questions to Determine Why God Let It Happen. We went through that in the episode that was the very first one before we started episode 1. But the graphic on screen says, will it prepare me for leadership? Will it result in the power of love? Will it equip me to counsel others? Gothard said, if he allows our physical to be damaged, it just increases your spiritual power. Heather said she almost became jealous of women who had been assaulted because it seemed God wanted to use them more. And then she stops and says, it's so weird to say that out loud. Josh P. said, if you track Gothard's teachings long enough, it's the playbook of a powerful narcissist. And also the dynamic of no checks and balances in place. Abuse was running rampant, and it was in all these facilities and in the homes. After arriving home from headquarters, Emily found a website called Recovering Grace. It was for people to share their stories of the abuse they experienced in ATI as well as their recoveries. This gave momentum for people to push back against Gothard for his sexual harassment. The front page had the title Sexual Harassment at Headquarters. Emily says she impulsively commented and said, here's my story. A few days later, of course, Bill Gothard calls. He's mad as all get out and tells her to remove that comment immediately. He would call her multiple times a day. Chad said the more stories that were shared on the website, they saw tons of similarities between those stories. His grooming behavior, touching hair, kind of petting women, lingering uncomfortable hugs, and playing footsie. Josh P. said that from the stories, it seemed whatever was repressed in Gothard came out in him by testing boundaries of seeing how far he could go before somebody freaked out. Gothard was accused of assaulting a woman, and they showed Gothard at a conference with a visual. The 7 vital steps when you are falsely accused. Gothard said it's like a cup of bitter water, and you must go through this public test. Gothard was removed from a leadership position due to the number of allegations that were starting to be put out there. There's a security camera recording of Gothard saying, "Just so you know, this property was given to me." Josh P. said there's a moment in the IBLP event where Gothard has to be physically removed out of the event by the same campus police he helped create. Clips from a report on TV where Bill Gothard was asked by an Alert Academy official to leave the private property, and he refused. This was in Big Sandy, Texas. They also show a criminal trespass report showing the date as April 23rd, 2018 at 10:30 p.m. Josh P. said they're still using his teachings, but they don't want the liability of Gothard himself as a part of the organization. Chad said if you're seen as useful, people cover up for you all day long. Gothard enjoyed that luxury until he was deemed not useful. Brooks said also the sharks were circling because you realize this institution had about $90 million in cash and assets and different funds. If you could get rid of Gothard, whoever's left gets that cash. They showed Jim Bob telling a crowd, "Bring your friends to these talks. It can change lives." And then they cut over to Jim and Bobby Holt, who were asked if they thought Jim Bob was trying to mimic Gothard. And Bobby said definitely, since Gothard was removed, her understanding was that Jim Bob and Michelle are now his replacement. Jim Holt says Jim Bob has changed so much, he doesn't even know if he's the same man he met or knew since he was 12. Bobby says they've encouraged people to join the IBLP and also to move to Arkansas, which she called a cult move. The clip of Jim Bob speaking is shown, and he says they were part of a mega church and started having services in their home on Sunday. And he said it was a special time for their family. She said they believe the way they live is how everybody should live. She said fundamentalists have been shined up and polished and put on TLC. Cousin Amy has not talked to Jim Bob since 2019. Her husband called him and said, "I'm seeing something about Homeland Security." And they also had reporters from other countries traveling to the States to question them about Homeland Security raids. They didn't know what was going on. They cut to news reports of Josh Duggar being indicted with federal counts for child sex abuse materials. They play a clip from when Josh Duggar was in the police car during the raid as it was happening. And an agent says they were able to determine that this business is where downloads had occurred. And there may be an electronic device that could have the images or videos on them. And they would like to know now if it's something that could be found. And get this, Josh says, "I'm not denying guilt. I'm not saying," and then he stumbles. "I mean, as far as anything goes, I don't want to say the wrong thing." Kristen said it didn't matter that Gothard had been ousted from this cult. The movement just kept going on. So that's it for episode 3. Tomorrow we'll finish this up with episode 4. I'm ready to move on. All very disturbing. And if I never hear of IBLP or Bill Gothard or Jim Bob and Michelle, I'm cool with that. All right, guys, we will see you soon. Hope you have a good rest of your day.